You hear me? Well, I want to begin by thanking Christoph and Gitanjali for having convened this conference, which reminds us of some of the key urgencies that face all of us, whether we are involved with the art world or in our, if you will, other lives as citizens. And it struck me that this fascinating word draft contains within it also the image of the raft. And it reminds me simultaneously of what to me is one of the most terrifying paintings ever painted, the raft of the Medusa, Jericho. And it reminds me also of the extraordinary emergency of what is happening in the Mediterranean, what is happening off the coast of Burma, the fact that many people today are literally at sea in conditions of extraordinary risk and insecurity and peril. And in a way, whilst that is a very concrete and terrible situation, it also speaks to the kind of so-called normality that many of us live under. And I want to thank particularly the Mexico City panel, the speakers from there, for drawing out with a richness of detail and with analytical rigor the conditions of this very constrained emergency normality in their part of the world. And there were very many thoughts that emerged, and I just want to annotate briefly some of the things that were said and then open up a discussion. Helena, thank you very much for beginning with laying out the fact that terror is very much a foundation of our constrained normality today, and for also going on to talk of how the category of the public, the experience of the public is an extremely vexed one. I'm thinking back to my own socialization in both the art world and in a certain kind of radical politics in the late 1980s at a campus not far from here, Elphinstone College, where these were the key questions that exercised us in many ways. How do you retain your commitment to a symbolic economy, which is what you're doing as an artist, as someone concerned with the imagination? And what is the connection between that symbolic economy and your commitment to it? And this other political economy in which there are other kinds of things at stake, questions of civil liberties, of rights, the discourse of citizenship. And in the course of that, how do we address this very peculiar beast called the public, which is forever being, on the one hand, ossified and fetishized and monopolized by the state, and on the other hand, it is always being renewed, reclaimed, and sought to be taken back by interpersonal exchanges, improvisations of unauthorized actors. And it's in that context also that, Cuauhtémoc, I want to thank you for your very provocative, very intense reflection on the monument, the nature of the memorial. And there was really, for me, a wonderful segue among the thoughts and preoccupations of all of you, because we are reminded here that just as the state seeks to ossify the public memory, particular kinds of histories through the form of the monument, this has to be met and counteracted, interrogated through the mode of the performative, through one or another kind of theater that is alive to both its potentials and its limitations. And again, Teatro Ojo brought that out. Brought that out by locating it, by embedding it really in this extremely apocalyptic sense of what happens in a society that has, if you will, inherited a legacy of violence that goes back a very long time ago. There's a violence inscribed into Central and South America, which goes back to 1492. There's an inscription of expansionism, of violence, of annihilation, that is the legacy of an imperial, a colonial project. And there are far more recent manifestations of this, which dramatize questions of who does the society belong to, who has the right of articulation, and what kinds of, I hesitate to use this word, but it's been a useful term for some of us over the years, what form of liberated zone could one develop where some of these questions can actually be addressed? Which is why I was very moved by your account of Lo que viene, which is in one sense an informal if you will, I use the word advisedly, subaltern, not top down, but from below attempt at achieving what the Truth and Reconciliation Committee set out to achieve. Whether it achieved that or not in South Africa is an open question. But I found that without the mechanisms of the state, this form, this platform of reflection and memory and articulation about a very troubled time uh, was of great interest. And it really blurred, as also the kinds of anti-monuments that you spoke about, Cuauhtémoc. These forms tend to break against the authorized, the official, the bureaucratic, the bureaucratization of memory and the bureaucratization of what is the public tend to get swept away in a certain way by these initiatives. But this leaves me with, even as we're engaging with the unsayable, what exceeds the official norm of sayability, I still remain haunted by the question of the temporality of protest. And particularly the temporality of protest in which artists participate, in which the work of the imagination is made public and shared. And I say this because very often the things we do in this vein, in this mode, tend to be reactive, they tend to be ephemeral, they tend to be temporary, they tend to be situational. And in what way can they possibly build into something that can oppose the power of the institutional, the institutionalized? So that this has been a question that's haunted me for a long time, and it haunted me throughout this morning, because it also speaks to the kinds of disquiets that Gitanjali raised in her opening remarks. How radical can contemporary art be? I want to bracket that question because it is too large a question to address immediately. But I think we might approach this in some way by maybe addressing some of these questions. There's something in the nature of what Bakhtin called the carnivalesque, which could be the festive, the ludic, the oppositional, which tends to be of a certain moment. And it gives us a reserve of opposition, of oppositionality to what is going forward. But how can that build into a coherent response? And what kind of solidarity could manifestations like this achieve with what, for better or ill, is a more concrete form of politics? So my question really is, do these manifestations, political as they are, adversarial as they are, what kind of purchase do they have on the grim material ground of concrete politics? So these are some of the questions that I would maybe open up before you. And maybe we have about 25 minutes. I don't know if I could maybe pose these in the form of questions to the panel, and then we open up to include everybody else.
Yeah, it's very interesting because you made a number of moves in relation to questions of temporality that probably give a chance to be more specific. I take an issue about relating what's happening today in a place like mine to a long-term historical perspective. It's a matter of numbers. In 2006, there were 600 people killed in gang violence events in Mexico. In 2007, there were 3,000. By now, there are 120,000 documented cases. So we have a change of numbers in a very short span of time. So bringing the Aztecs into the picture doesn't help, to put it, a little bit ironically. What we have instead is a combination of very contemporary events. First, a change in the line of production and circulation of drugs in the Americas, where the Colombian ruling of the chain of distribution was broken down by the actions of American state, and then somebody had to take over. And in neoliberal terms, distribution takes command over production centers. So therefore, the distributors are in charge. Secondly, a crisis in the logic of peasanthood in Mexico provoked by the neoliberal agenda that I was alluding. Basically, they disenfranchised probably around 100 million people from their specific ways of traditional living and the security of their economic and gender positions into the new labor market of insecurity and where women take over in sweatshop factories and then men can get a little bit angry and start shooting around. That's, I mean, a little bit of a reductive view of what can be happening. Thirdly, there is an erosion of the structure of the nation state, the post-colonial state, if you want to call it that way, the post-revolutionary state, that because became the manager of the neoliberal transformation, lost any social authority. And there's something very odd for people like us that are pseudo-punks dressed in global customs, which is to recognize that the moment you have a break of social and cultural authority, it can get messy. That we know in our experience in the last 40 years that in several places of the world, there are structures of self-containment that have been broken by the arrival of the consumerist objectivity and the loss of a referent of social authority. It's horrible. It's like that. Therefore, maybe I can move into another question, which is, I have a feeling that it's important for us to know that the temporality of the social movement always rules, and we cannot define it. It's true, we are reactive. Now, that's not been all the time the case. In this particular conjuncture in Mexico, what we're probably not reporting properly is the fact that the project that the Mexican left engaged from around 1985, at the time of the earthquake, when the radical left abandoned the revolutionary project and joined electoral politics, and when resistance movements allied with electoral politics into trying to challenge the official party in Mexico, that project failed. That was the project of my generation. I was involved in that. I was voting and even proselytizing for the PRD in Mexico. And suddenly, people elected by the PRD conducted these killings. So therefore, there's a very specific change of temporality, where a certain lame, stupid, reformist, leftist sector is now orphaned. And there's an upsurge of anarchism that has to do with the replacement of that reformist politics. So it's a moment of transition. So the only long-term politics that remains in that specific case is that of the memory of a failure, if I can put it that way. It's not that there was no long-term investment in a certain number of alternatives. It's that we blatantly failed because we cannot win against the changes of the neoliberal transformation, the revolution of life, of neoliberalism is amazing. Lenin never expected something so big happening so fast. It's pathetic. I mean, I'm a Bukharinist. Sorry to cross the bridge. And it's clear to me that Bukharin would have simply stared, thinking, this is really changing the life for the market. I mean, it's a new economic policy of unbelievable extent. So I'm making an argument that probably, and I hope that has to do with what I was trying to make in my paper about my concerns of the politics of memory, we are in a moment when we are siding against the corner and against the wall, because again, the incredible ability of the bourgeoisie to be the most revolutionary class in history and to actually generate a global revolution is taken all of us, I mean, by surprise. We cannot advance a specific project in a situation that is so volatile and agile, and is clearly a very interesting challenge. Now, that doesn't change the fact that I agree in a very deep sense with the view that culture, if it is not taken hysterically, and what I mean by hysterically, I, I mean by the outlook of a pressure and moral obligation of activism and the expectation that we are going to actually change everything through a magical recipe that is going to appear in some corner of the world. Culture has this long-term space of efficacy. We are part of the factors of the world. It's a soft power that actually is able to cross generations, languages, and social structures that produces forms of identification that are self-critical. I mean, I believe that that's something that, independently of our gestures of immediate response, actually is produced within a certain continuum. And maybe, indeed, is not a spectacular continuum, but that is what makes it very interesting because it actually facilitates people that are difficult to remove. You can even remove them. I mean, as the old saying says, you can kill the person, but you cannot kill the idea. It's a very, very strange thing that ideas can take possession of corpses and bodies across, across generations. So, in a way, that's why the question of monumentality is not shallow, because there's this constant pacing. I made a mistake in not thinking, telling something about this idea of the monuments having their faces covered. You know what is very interesting that because I'm in India, I thought, yeah, sure, that here is just Hinduism. Like, images look at us. Of course, that's unbelievable, unthinkable in a Christian perspective. The Catholic idol is an idol that you need to stare at. You never have Dharma. Yeah, God. So there's this issue that is interesting, that how do we relate to these things? But clearly, I find it interesting that precisely because of the short temporality that we are describing, that is being very short, it's just a collapse that has taken 2-3 decades, and it's a spectacular moment of violence at worst is just a matter of 6 years. The perspective of a long term looking into what is happening to us is quite unforgiving. Unforgiveness. It is something that is not easy to negotiate with. Anyway, maybe.
Also, I think in this relationship between some kind of activism and art, there is an overlapping of temporality, which is very important in the sense our reactions as artists or cultural people in Mexico City is part of this activism, and it's always a response, an urgent response. But later on, when this kind of wave, the tide goes down, is the moment for the art as an object to create another temporality that erupts in another part that it's really important, that is the construction of the public in universities and museums. I mean, other debate that is going on in Mexico is the role that museums has in this crisis. There is a debate going on and some kind of interventions that we are creating as a contemporary art scene, demanding the state to keep the budget. The budget has been cut in the last year, like 40% of the budget of culture has been cut. So there's also this question of which is the role of art and contemporary art in this situation of social emergency. So it's also this kind of debate of what can it mean to have a public university and the construction of politics that university can create, and what is the construction of the public museum or the role of the museums in this kind of moment. And I think that intertwines different temporalities that are working on. I mean, of course, it's a short-term temporality, but it's extended by the question of what kind of institutions we want to build. So in this sense, there is an articulation that is really intense by activists and artists and also people working in the cultural institution as Cuauhtémoc. I mean, he's as you know, the chief curator of one of the most important museums in Mexico City. So it's also the question, if is the museum a public space? So which is the role of museum in this moment of crisis? So I think the temporality extends until the next moment of uprisal, but because we are acting in this moment of the next fire. So we're acting just like, so when is going to be the next killing? So we are acting like that in a different waves, like temporality waves that interconnect and create some kind of question that it's permanent. Also, I mean, it's really interesting that art, I mean, the social reaction against the killing of the 43 students was really surprising for us because art scene has been working on this like since 5 years before, like society realized what was going on. So also it's really interesting how art is like in a constant pointing out what is going on. So there is an interesting, yeah, dialogue going on there.
Well, perhaps just perhaps just say that as well because of what is going on during these last years in Mexico. As well, think I mean the possibility of art to at least try to liberate I just call like that big production of fear that is going on. I mean with the images and with the information and with the news and somehow that thing that we're always expecting that what's the new crime or what's the new body that we're gonna end up seeing. So somehow and lo que viene I think was this attempt to be able to liberate within the participation of the people that was there some of this fear that has been interiorized by the people. So I believe, I guess, that part of the effectiveness of art has to do with that possibility as well. At least that as a first step to be able to, to be able to make something, other things appeared, and keep working towards that.
Well, thank you for those responses, and I think we can now open it up if people have questions.
Okay, I'm Rohit. Thank you very much for the very impressive presentations. And I was very struck by this notion of the crisis that you used, I felt, in a very ambivalent way. On the one hand, it was something which was like produced by the state, as you say, production of fear, on the one hand, and on the other hand, you used crisis as a ontological state or state of what you feel, and also as the departure for activism or art. So I was wondering, when we have these different understandings and narratives of crisis, especially a very hegemonic one, is it useful to use it as a point of departure, especially when we look at the last 20 years, the context of globalization? We have 9/11, war on terror, we have in Europe a crisis of immigration, a crisis of the state, of the welfare state, and so on, so that we could argue that actually the crisis is like a hegemonic strategy of the state, in the sense of Carl Schmitt, to put everybody in a state of exception. So my question is, when you use the word crisis as a point of departure, how would you differentiate this term from this Schmittian way of state strategy?
I kind of disagree with the idea that our different positions are departing from a notion of crisis as a state strategy. And here, probably I need to tell you a couple of things. One is that where you're being very perceptive is in a very specific condition of Mexican arguments, and is that most of them, not me, we were born in a state of crisis that has been renewed every first 5 years and then every 3 months. It basically has been the term defining the space of narratives and living in that country since 1968, 1976. I was born in 65, so apparently I lived before crisis. And it was very funny how late writer Carlos Monsiváis used to say very cleverly that we were in a state of post-apocalyptic condition, that the apocalypse had already come and we didn't realize. And so this is something that I grant might be not only ambivalent, but might be a condition of discourse, that might be even something like a chant. Now, however, I would not pass a economic line, follow the idea that there is ultimate power creating this. I think that your allusion to the provocation of fear is not the provocation of the crisis, but is actually the way in which public opinion is governed so as to have right-wing governments. I mean, what we have, and that's an experience that can be validated at every election in Mexico, but it's also very central to the production of power in Europe and the United States today, is that the instigation of fear is the precondition of the management of the citizens. Now, this, of course, has to come to the issue that, in fact, since 1973, when the Chilean junta took power, the management of neoliberal politics in the economic field had to do with shaking the security of the population through deliberate forms of erosion of social structures so as to allow the logic of quick investment to take over. And that is precisely the source of the notion that there's a management of crisis. But this is not without contradictions to the fact that, I mean, we have, on the one hand, a structure that is trying to keep on creating stability, particularly in the north, that is indifferent to the upheaval that the management of the capitalist economy produces in the south, that takes over the mind of the public when there's a space of opinion and decision through the instigation of fear, and at the same time that is not entirely away from the preoccupation with the crises that are produced. So there is this complicated business of power today that has all those different levels, which is not only that of a instrumentation of crisis, but certainly all those ambivalences from an ontological condition. I mean, what is more ontological than saying most of the people in this table were born into crisis and they are going to die into crisis? I don't have any doubt about that. They are full of crisis in their veins. At the same time, doesn't allow us to miss the fact that when you actually look at the moment of loss of governance, it might involve also a problem for the investors. I mean, one of the biggest problems of a country located in the connection between the south and the north, like Mexico, is that the upheaval that is necessary to keep cheap labor is as simple as that. You need a social upheaval so as to be able to have dependable labor force. It reaches a point where it actually creates lots of problems so that it actually prevents investment. Yeah? So there's a very complicated kind of balance that I presume goes into the head of somebody at one point, but normally sleep as time goes moment by moment.
And also I will say that this ambivalence in the crisis is what the government finds helpful to keep going. In this sense, for example, I want to say that this is a social crisis because people, for once in like, I don't know, like 20 years, since 94 I guess, is the one pressing to keep the crisis on. I mean, it's people that is just, I mean, people, medium and government want to erase the problem of the disappeared students. So they say like, the phrase was history, this is a truth history, no.
Historical truth is they were killed by
truth.
two.
I mean, the chief of the government said like, this is an historical truth. They have been killed, and this is over. So people, please move on to the next crisis. And people is saying that like, no, we're not moving until the 43 people are with us. So in a sense, I think there is a tension to keep on going with the crisis, to say like, okay, now we have an economical one, so people keep moving, please, to people saying, no, we're not moving from this one. And that is a really, really complex issue in temporality, because we're just like linked to the disappearance of these 43 students that are some kind of symptom of the 300 people that have been murdered, and I don't know the number of people that have been disappearing in the country in the last 8 years. So it's a really complex situation how we manage crisis. We keep going until the next one, or we just like stay in this kind of demand of appearance of the disappeared. No? So there is a complex tension there that is very interesting.
I'm really worried. I think I'm really worried maybe because of a set of questions that have emerged through the introduction this morning and also through the presentations, which I want to sort of like lay back on the table for discussion. And that is, I think, it is a question I also ask myself very much, where there is a distinction between the sort of social aspect of art, and by that I would restrict it only to art's ability to respond. So really in the strictest sense, like ethical responsibility. And on the one hand, and then on the other hand, where art has the undertones of becoming more moral, like where there is a moralistic kind of expectation of art, of placing art at the forefront. Art has to be radical. What does art do in relation to the political? You said something about art being, ahead of something rather. And I think these kind of questions, and there's many others in my notes, but not to recap extensively, but it's just a question of, I don't really know why there's so much emphasis placed on the questioning of the function of art when, as a general category that is in itself not very definitive, when precisely what we need to be focusing on is what it facilitates for us in terms of practice. So that on the one hand, and then if we want to talk about more project-specific things, or then the larger question of the idea, if it is actually possible to take a step back and revert back to questioning how art is able to respond and what those means of response are, so meaning talking about form as medium, rather than talking about the more moral aspects and questions.
It's a very interesting question, and I was just on the way to Bombay. I stopped to see the Venice Biennial, and I was surprised on how good it was, because I had heard so many wrong things about it. So I came to the conclusion that there was an enormous international hatred at the fact that there was a biennial that was politically precise, mixed with something that I would call as left-wing self-punishment, which is we cannot praise our wise men, we cannot celebrate the possibility that there's a moment when there's a certain recuperation of formal and political significance, because there's a constant drive to actually punish those that construct politically or set a standard or expectation on them that in itself is impossible to achieve. So it is made so as to become always self-repressive. And sorry to bring that in relation to Venice to make an issue that is indeed, there is a lot of disquiet coming from a moralistic demand. Now, this might be theoretical and it's a figure of speech in many places. At home, in my place, this has become an excruciatingly complicated situation in the last 2-3 years. Most young artists, most artists that are under 30, are emerging into the contemporary art field with an incredible naive expectation of social efficacy and an incredibly moralistic position towards what is to be done and not done in the artistic field. I take it, because I belong to the old modernist prejudice that the young are always right, that they might be right, even though I have 300 objections against what they're saying. Now, because of that modernist prejudice that the young must be right, what I need to say is that clearly the feeling that our promises of social significance and of meaningfulness, and even the gains coming from the South that my generation can attest of the fact that we finally have a place we are taking seriously and we participate, all that some of us struggled or saw the people struggling for a long time, have not actually fulfilled or any actual recordable advantage. They appear as banal and meaningless. Therefore, that malaise is now reaching a particularly high moment. I have the feeling that that's the reason why it is being so moralistic. I also lament with you the loss of something that, or probably I would say without you, I lament myself the loss of a certain notion of social irresponsibility that in my personal experience was a core aspect what making or being part of contemporary art meant. I would like to have that space. I long for it. Good, refined punk defiance. But certainly the situation is not allowing that to have a space, but in a transvestite political agency. I agree. Now, what to do about it? I guess that first, for me at least, it's good to keep always several agendas, to cheat. My position is sometimes simplified as to saying it's very good to have morals, but you don't need to wear them all the time. To actually play two cards that somehow the strife of complexity and multiplicity that was presented in the opening address, to me involves that we also involve the multiplicity of being demanded by this moral demand, and at the same time goofing around, without thinking that those things are contradictory, because they are not. They are necessary. It is important to goof around it's important to keep a continuous attention to questions of formal modernist involvement, and at the same time we can do politics in the afternoon. Now, because nobody's able to fish any longer, so we also do politics. That's, I mean, somehow I would like to say that.
In the afternoon is probably the key phrase here, because we're out of time on this session. But I really want to thank everybody who spoke for this enormous survey of questions, strategies, provocations, and indeed we should take these thoughts with us into the more informal space of lunch and come back at 2 o'clock for the next session. So thank you very much indeed.